My fellow Australians, today I am issuing a formal call for an Australian Pecora Commission to investigate the corruption and likely criminality of the personnel and policies which dominate our banking and financial system, which have brought our nation to the verge of economic collapse. There is now no question that Australia is following the rest of the world into what my good friend Lyndon LaRouche, the American statesman and physical economist, has characterised as a global economic breakdown crisis. Any illusion people may have clung to before Christmas that 2009 should be better than 2008 has been rudely shattered by the harsh shock of further market falls, the continued collapse of world trade, and, most importantly, the wholesale evaporation of jobs in most sectors of Australian economy. Australia lost 44,000 full-time jobs in December, but that is just the beginning. The mining sector has canned $60 billion worth of expansion plans and is starting to shut down existing operations. Officially, BHP has just slashed 6,000 mining jobs, and its twin mining giant, the Queen's own Rio Tinto, has announced 2,000 jobs will go, which will be followed by thousands more as it struggles with its enormous debts. But CEC members and supporters in Western Australia report an ongoing, stunning collapse of most of the mining industry and the myriad of businesses built around it. Establishment economist Ed Shan calculated in the Financial Review on the 12th of January that as of April, when the current contracts for supplying coal and iron ore to China expire, Australia will suffer a $30 billion collapse in national export income, or 2.5%. A 30% rise in the cost of imports over exports, and a devastating 7% drop in national income per head. Shan's former bureau, Access Economics, came out this week and declared the budget is buggered, and predicted Australia in 2009 will suffer its sharpest economic contraction in history. On the back of this, unemployment will be driven up, property prices will be driven down, and all those young people rushing to apply for Kevin Rudd's first home owners grant will bitterly regret it. As this unfolds, Australia's banks will be in a worse crisis than the US, British and European counterparts are in now. Our banks have built up a $14 trillion over-the-counter derivatives exposure leveraged upon inflated property prices and other fictitious asset values that amount to nothing more than unpayable debt. The Commonwealth Government and the Reserve Bank have already been desperately propping up and bailing out the Australian banks by pledging to guarantee $2 trillion in deposits, by almost daily cash injections from the Reserve Bank, and by the future funds depositing $35 billion among the various banks. All the while, of course, insisting the banks are sound. All of this will change nothing. The collapse will accelerate. Lyndon LaRouche has long insisted that the only way the financial system can be fixed is for national governments to place it into bankruptcy administration, what Americans call Chapter 11, whose purpose is to reorganise the system by freezing or cancelling the speculative paper such as derivatives, while keeping the viable sectors of that system functioning, those which provide necessary services and credit to the community and to the physical economy. My party, the CEC, has the legislation ready to go to conduct this kind of bankruptcy reorganisation for Australia. However, before this is possible, we must clean up the corruption and the criminality endemic in the current system, which is why the CEC is echoing Lyndon LaRouche's demand in the US for a new Pecora Commission to investigate Wall Street by calling for a similar investigation here in Australia. The Pecora Commission was a US Senate investigation from 1932 to 1934, headed up by New York Public Prosecutor Ferdinand Pecora, which fearlessly and ruthlessly probed the corrupt dealing of the Wall Street banks and financiers that had brought on the Great Depression. With the full backing of President Franklin Roosevelt, Pecora hauled some of the most prominent bankers in the nation, including J.P. Morgan Jr. and Henry Lamont, before the committee and revealed them to be, under their pompous, self-righteous veneer, a pack of self-serving, arrogant and corrupt hyenas who had little regard for the interests of the nation and its people, but who had dominated the US economy and manipulated it to suit their own goals. One of the prime targets of the Pecora hearings was J.P. Morgan, both man and bank. Through its direct and interlocking directorships, Pecora said, Morgan had, quote, incomparably the greatest reach of power in private hands in our entire history. The hearings revealed that Morgan maintained what it called preferred lists of powerful men in finance, business, politics, public life, to whom he would offer securities at less than market value and provide other favours. Morgan insisted that these were simple business transactions, for which he expected nothing in return. Pecora's investigation smashed the claims by the bankers and their publicists that they were only conducting a public service, and it helped build the public support President Franklin Roosevelt required to force Congress to pass tough regulatory reforms. That laid the foundation for FDR's New Deal economic recovery program. Roosevelt's New Deal is the model for the policies that must be pursued today if we are to recover from this economic collapse. But he could never have done that without first crushing the bitter resistance of the corrupt financial oligarchy. By contrast to the US, no other nation during the Depression took on the entrenched power of the private bankers. Instead, the banks took over governments, especially in Europe, and imposed fascism. In Australia in the 1920s, the banker-controlled government of Stanley Melbourne Bruce had handed control of the People's Bank, the Commonwealth Bank, over to private financiers by replacing the governor of the bank with a big business-controlled board of directors. When the Depression hit, those private financiers squashed the Labor government's economic recovery plan to fund public works and create employment. The Scullin government's treasurer, E.G. Theodore, whom the terrified private bankers called Red Ted, asked the Commonwealth Bank for £18 million to fund public works, but the bank spat in his face. Its chairman, Sir Robert Gibson, said to Theodore, "You are asking me to inflate the money supply? I tell you, I bloody well won't." As chairman of the bank, Gibson was essentially a public servant. His arrogance to refuse a directive from the democratically elected government epitomised the way the private banks saw themselves as a power above that of government. People these days often forget the reality of what happened in Australia during the Great Depression because it's written out of our history books. But the bankers, such as Sir Robert Gibson himself, organised and financed mass fascist armies like the Old Guard and the New Guard in New South Wales and the Melbourne-based League for League of National Security, which were fully prepared to conduct military coups against state or federal Labor governments, such as the Lang government in New South Wales or the Scullin federal government, if those governments would not knuckle under to the financiers. Great Labor thinkers like Frank Anstey and Jack Lang called this private financial combine the money power. It was directed from the City of London, which governed Australia as a colonial possession, to be looted for its raw materials and manpower. But by refusing to provide credit to mitigate or solve the depression, the private financiers controlling the Commonwealth Bank unleashed increasing rage in a depression-ravaged population, which fueled support for Labor's calls for an investigation of Australia's banking system similar to the Pecora Commission. However, it wasn't the Labor Party which got an investigation up and running, but a fairly new and young Country Party MP from Victoria, John McEwen, who passionately represented the interests of family farmers and soldier settlers and clearly saw the economic damage inflicted on the economy by the privately controlled Commonwealth Bank. In 1935, McEwen moved a motion in federal parliament which appointed a royal commission, quote, to inquire into the monetary and banking systems at present in operation in Australia and to report whether any, and if so what, alterations are desirable in the interests of the people of Australia as a whole and the manner in which any such alterations should be effected. The 1936 Royal Commission did not force the private banks to account for the practices which caused the depression, and it did not question the system whereby the only public bank, the Commonwealth, was controlled by a private financier-linked board of directors, so it was no Pecora Commission. But it did establish one vital principle, that, and I quote, the federal Parliament is ultimately responsible for monetary policy and the government of the day is the executive of the Parliament, end quote. The Commission's minority report, however, was much tougher and foreshadowed the direction that we must take today. It was written by future Labor Treasurer and Prime Minister Ben Chifley, who was temporarily out of Parliament at the time. In that dissenting report, Chifley argued that the welfare of the Australian people as a whole could not be achieved if it were dependent on private banks, which are run solely for private profit, to issue the necessary public credit. Banks should not be treated like any other businesses, Chifley argued, because the impact they have on the economy as a whole is akin to that of a public utility, like the water or electricity supply. If banks expand credit rapidly, they create bubbles and blow out the economy. If they shut off credit, as they did during the Depression, they shut down the economy. He wrote, "A banking policy should have one aim, service for the general good of the community. The making of profit is not necessary to such a policy." Although falling well short of what was required, the Commission did recommend that the private banks should operate under a government licence, or should only operate under a government licence. They should provide the government, through the Commonwealth Bank, with accurate statistics so the Commonwealth Bank can make informed decisions as to the functioning of the whole banking system, and that all private banks should deposit funds in special accounts in the Commonwealth Bank in amounts set by the Federal Treasurer, so the Commonwealth Bank would be able to regulate the money supply. The private banks were furious. They demanded that they should be entirely independent, free from any government control, and vowed a fight to the death against even these limited recommendations for the public good. The bank's demands for total independence was a farce. In fact, as some leaders of the Labor Party charged, Australia's monetary system was completely dominated by the City of London's banking houses centred around the privately owned Bank of England. Their demand for a so-called independence meant independence from any direction or control by a democratically elected government of Australia. As Labor stated at that time, only if the Australian government controlled the money system would Australia be truly sovereign. By denying the government that control, the London-run banks kept Australia under British control. The Royal Commission handed down its report in 1937. In the ensuing years, the banks were able to stall any implementation of the recommendations because proving everything Labor and Chifley had charged, they effectively owned the governing political party of the day, the Joe Lyons, Robert Menzies United Australia Party. But when Labor took power in 1942, under John Curtin as Prime Minister and Ben Chifley as Treasurer, Chifley was finally able to implement the Royal Commissioner's recommendations. The result was that Australia's banking system performed spectacularly during World War II. In the interest of all the people of Australia, the banks were licensed, the Commonwealth Bank regulated their investment portfolios and controlled their advances, the interest rates they could charge and pay, and the volume of funds the banks deposited in special accounts in the Commonwealth Bank. Under this regime, not only did Australia's physical economy undergo a miraculous wartime transformation from a mining grazing backwater to an advanced industrial economy, but the nation's financial system was free from any bank-induced inflation and wartime profiteering. After the war, the private banks regrouped their fascist militias of the 1930s into a new mass fascist army known as the Association, which was fully prepared to use armed force against the federal Labor government in case Chifley succeeded in making his wartime banking reforms permanent. With the help of the British Crown's Privy Council and the banker-owned mass media which terrorised the population, the private financiers defeated Chifley's reforms and once again took control over the economy. Today, my message is that Australia's financial system must be and can be reorientated to serve the common good, the way Curtin and Chifley did during World War II. But we must break the money power once and for all, which is why I am calling for an Australian Pecora Commission. Australia's crisis demands we do not dance around arguments about processes and procedures with regards to banking. Rather, it is time to name names. We are in a worse crisis than the 1930s depression because every edifice of effective government control of banking was torn down over the past 30 years by political leaders completely in the service of private finance. I am calling for a national inquiry with the brief to examine every aspect of how this was done and who benefited. Any corruption or criminality must be exposed no matter how high it goes up. It is clear that financial crimes against the nation have been committed, but in most cases under a legal veneer provided by politicians in the form of deregulation and competition policies. However, just because once illegal and utterly immoral activities have been legalised doesn't make them any less wrong or, as we are discovering, any less damaging to the nation. Let me briefly sketch the history of how the deregulation of Australia's financial system was achieved. In 1979, then Treasurer John Howard appointed a leading financier, Sir Keith Campbell, to head the Committee of Inquiry into Australian Financial System, popularly known as the Campbell Committee. Campbell was not only the head of the Hooker Corporation here in Australia, but he was closely tied to the Mellon Bank in the United States, part of the exact same Wall Street gang which the Pecora Commission had investigated. Campbell's report set the scene for radical deregulation of the nation's financial system, exactly as Howard and those who owned him intended. However, Campbell's proposals were so radical, Howard was unable to attract sufficient political support in the Fraser government to implement them, but in a tragic irony that would have had Curtin and Chifley turning in their graves, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating implemented these measures beginning when Labor came to power in 1983. Hawke and Keating deregulated the banks, floated the Australian dollar, scrapped capital controls, lifted restrictions on interest rates and opened Australia up to foreign banks like Macquarie Bank, which started as just the Australian branch of the City of London's mighty Hill Samuel Bank and Lehman Brothers. They initiated a massive privatisation program which included Australia's greatest financial institution, the Commonwealth Bank. In the decade after Howard completed the bank's privatisation in 1996, the big four Australian banks raked in over $70 billion in profits. In 1989, Keating set up compulsory superannuation, which generated and directed a flow of money, now over $1 trillion, out of workers' pay packets and into a deregulated financial system dominated by unleashed private banks and new institutions like hedge funds and private equity funds, along with new forms of money called derivatives, which were formerly illegal. Now, it is evident that compulsory superannuation has just fed a giant Ponzi scheme, the biggest in history, and superannuants will be lucky to see any of it. The inquiry should investigate whether this was in fact the real purpose of super in the first place. Then, in 1991, Keating and the State Treasurers signed off on a now notorious report by a Macquarie Bank executive, Fred Hilmer, into competition policy. This report mandated all levels of government to allow private financial interests to take down every area of the economy under public ownership or control or government regulation under the spurious demand to increased competition. Another Macquarie Bank executive, Graham Samuel, was picked to enforce this new policy, first through the National Competition Council and now through the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. In the early 1990s, Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett and Treasurer Alan Stockdale went on the biggest privatisation spree of any nation in the world in world history, selling $30 billion in assets in 3 years, all under the cover of new competition policy. The head of Kennett's Business Roundtable of Advisors was Macquarie Bank boss Laurie Cox. Macquarie Bank financed the think tank called the Tasman Institute, which co-wrote Kennett's privatisation blueprint entitled Project Victoria, and Macquarie Bank earned tens of millions of dollars in fees from the Victorian government for brokering the sales, not to mention what it made from its own investment in the sales. Macquarie looted New South Wales as well. During the 1990s, Premier Bob Carr signed numerous public-private partnership deals, PPPs, with Macquarie, which gave the bank incredibly generous concessions on toll roads, which bank spokesmen later bragged were a, quote, licence to print money. Carr's protege and successor, Morris Yemmer, continued the policy to the point of wrecking his state and his own political party by trying to ram through the privatisation of the New South Wales electricity system to finance the extension of Macquarie Bank's M4 motorway. When Victorian Treasurer Alan Stockdale left politics, he went to work for Macquarie Bank. When New South Wales Premier Bob Carr quit suddenly in 2005, it was for a $500,000 per year job with Macquarie. Paul Keating's sister Anne works for Macquarie. John Howard's brother Stan works for Macquarie, and other members of both Howard and Keating's cabinets now work for Macquarie Bank. In fact, rumours are now flying that Peter Costello, or perhaps John Howard himself, will soon take up a position with Macquarie. Between 1993 and 2008, Macquarie Bank's funds under management grew from $8.9 billion to $232 billion. Its annual profit grew from $59 million to $1.8 billion. Its number of employees expanded from 132 to 13,000, and its net worth from $341 million to $16 billion. The great working class hero Bob Hawke boasts in his memoirs that he stacked his own government's Martin Committee inquiry into the financial system to ensure it recommended deregulation. So Australia could be part of the, quote, globalisation of the world economy, with rapid-fire electronic transfers of hundreds of billions of dollars occurring daily across the foreign exchange markets. Since leaving office, Hawke has amassed a personal fortune estimated at $50 million from property investment. Paul Keating now chairs Lazard Carnegie Wiley, the merchant bank founded by CS First Boston privatisation guru John Wiley, who made hundreds of millions in fees brokering privatisations in New Zealand and Australia. The bank is now a subsidiary of the notorious Lazard Frères Bank, which financed the Nazis during World War II, and is a partner with Macquarie Bank in privatisation and private infrastructure investments all over the world. After 25 years of the policies of this gang, Australia's economy is ruined. And it's not just the financial system. Our manufacturing has been destroyed. The number of family farmers has collapsed by more than half. Our foreign debt has blown out from $25 billion to over $1 trillion. Our water, rail and power infrastructure is collapsing, and our public hospitals and schools are run down. This is not an economic cycle. This is a crime. Thus, in order to organise a recovery, we must first bring the perpetrators to justice. I therefore urge all my fellow Australians, most of whom are finding themselves in increasingly desperate straits, to support my call for a thoroughgoing investigation, for an Australian Pecora-style commission, so we can break this money power once and for all and reorientate our government and our banking and our financial system to serve the common good. Don't petition your MP about it. Demand it. It's your sovereign right. Even more, it is your sovereign duty. That is, if you want to have a nation left to live in or for your children and grandchildren to grow up in. I will lead this fight, and I know exactly what to do, but I need your help. And so I am today calling upon all Australians to act and to join me to fight for what is just. Thank you.